confirmation right now. Also, if you have questions, you can feel free to put those in the chat after our speaker has completed, or you can raise your hand or turn on your camera and unmute yourself and ask your question post Dr. Stevenson's session. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Matur.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. It's always good to hear from Dr. Stevenson. She's been a really valuable colleague at UTSA, a great resource for everything to do with research integrity, ethics, etc. It's been my pleasure to work with her on several different things. And as I said, learn from her. And we're going to talk about her career trajectory as well as other kinds of positions in research administration, how she pivoted between different careers from being in the tenure track and tenured positions to research administration, helping everybody, as her title of the talk suggests. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stevenson, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Matur. Good morning, everybody. I will go ahead and share my screen with you so you can actually see my slides. Okay, it looks like it's shared. So I always lose your faces when that happens. The one thing that I want to start with today is to talk about why I chose this title. It's Researchers Helping Researchers. I just naturally gravitate towards careers that don't promote me, but promote others. That's just my personality. That's what drives me. And in that's how I use compliance as helping others. It's not just doing a job. It's not just fulfilling an obligation as the federal regulators might want you to think, but it's actually helping others. So let me tell you what I mean by that. But before I do that, I want to tell you who I am so that you know kind of where I came from. As Dr. Matur said, I came up in psychology. So I grew up in human development and family studies on the East Coast. So I went to NC State and then the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And my focus was on helping people, as you can imagine, and that was more towards older adults, gerontology, looking at social support in later life. So I went the tenure track route, was an assistant professor at Virginia Tech, and then for family reasons and personal reasons, chose to leave the tenure track. And that was a huge decision. I always thought that I would be, in the academy as a professor, helping students, doing research that helped people in services, et cetera. And then I needed to move, looked at my options and did kind of a skills analysis. Well, what do I have and what drives me? What do I want to do? So there was this really neat position, University of Texas System Administration, in their research office. And the UT system, if you don't know, is over all University of Texas institutions. So that's UT Southwestern, MD Anderson, Tyler, Arlington, Dallas, El Paso, San Antonio, et cetera. So when they closed that office, I was research specialist. When they closed that office, I needed to, I was RIF'd, and then went back to what skills do I have, what drives me, and I really decided to go back to a campus. And that's when I was hired as the Director of Ethical Conduct of Research at UTSA. Now, for those of you who are graduate students on the call, you're probably wondering, well, that must have been a huge financial loss going from a professor position tenure track to research specialist, which sounds like a more analyst type position. Well, it was a very analyst type position, but it was very high level. And so it was a huge salary bump for me. It wasn't a decrease in salary. And I got to interact with and understand the issues that vice presidents for research were dealing with, chief technology officers that deal with patents and licenses and commercialization issues. So it was exposure to a lot of high-level administration from an analyst's type point of view. But I needed to have that experience as an assistant professor to be good at any of that and to understand any of that. So as director of ethical conduct of research and now AVP for research integrity, I have focused on things like conflict of interest, research misconduct, and I'll go into more detail about that. One thing that I also did along the way is I got a certified compliance and ethics professional certification, and that's the CCEP. And I encourage any of you who are not looking at tenure track to look at what other certifications would help promote you as a subject matter expert in a particular area. And you may have to explain what that is. And I have to do that with the CCEP occasionally, because it's not something known. You know, if you were an assistant professor, people know that, but a CCEP, they probably don't know unless you spell it out, and they're still like, well, what does that really mean? Okay, so somebody certified you, ding, as compliance and ethics professional. But it just means that I'm familiar with the laws, best practices, and consequences of compliance and ethics. And the CCEP is more general than the academic area. So it gets into industry and industry compliance as well. So what I want to cover with you today is I'm asking you, those of you who are graduate students, to look at what skills you have, and postdoc trainees too, and anybody who is looking at changing careers. But what skills do you have? Don't sell yourself short, and don't oversell yourself in areas that you have weakness. So we'll talk about that. What is your disposition? What is your passion? What is your drive? What do you really want to do? And there's an ideal, what you're willing to settle for, and then what you're just willing not to take. So doing that analysis will save you a lot of time, heartache, disappointment, etc. And then kind of the meat of the compliance discussion is what options are there for you in compliance areas or regulatory areas, and where can you go for more information? So I encourage every single one of you to look at what skills you have. As a researcher, somebody who is doing graduate studies, who is involved in research, you have certain skills that you may not think about how they can apply to other situations. And you think, well, all graduate school is preparing me for is a tenure track position. And you know what? I don't want to do that. That's okay. I am happy to talk with you about what skills you do have in training for that tenure track position that can help you in other careers. But think about it. What makes you unique? Think about your competition in the workforce. How can you set yourself apart? How can you market yourself, your skills, and acknowledge them yourself, and then be able to communicate that to people who are interested in hiring people like you? But also be honest with yourself. What is missing? You know, if you just really aren't good at communicating in large offices, in large audiences, but you are great one-on-one, then be honest with yourself. If that's something that you are willing to learn how to do and have more experience in, then go for it. But if you're not willing, or you don't feel like you can get better in that, let it go. It's okay. So think about your strengths, really focus on those, but don't diminish and don't try to explain away your weaknesses. You don't have to apologize for something that you're good at or something just isn't the core you. And then think about how can you fill a gap between what you have and what's needed. So you have this ideal job in mind, and what will it take to get there? Be strategic. Reach out to people, advisors, mentors, significant others, best friends, family, enemies. Ask them those questions. Tell them to hold a mirror up to you. And so that you can see how you are portrayed by others, and not only what you think of yourself, which could be very different from how others think of you. But don't just put all your eggs in one basket. Don't just ask one or two people. You need a wide variety of people giving you that feedback. And it's not always going to be easy, but it's very important to get you where you want to go. So let's talk about the skills that you have as a researcher. Writing, presenting, and teaching. Those are three things that are so important no matter what career you go into. If you're a good writer, that just means good. You don't have to be outstanding, but a good writer, you can put things together in actual sentences and not text talk. Then you're ahead of the game. Presenting, if you can share that information to your boss, if you can share that information to a small group, to a team of people that you're working with, if you can state your case, state why that is your case, you know, the support that you have for that case, and then why that's important, that's huge. That is a great skill to have. And then being able to teach others. So reporting goes into that writing thing. Planning, researchers are great at planning. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at planning your own life, right? But we can be good at planning in some areas and really bad at planning it in others. Some researchers are really good at planning their experiments, or really bad planning their finances. It just is, right? They can rely on other people to help them in those areas. But generally, researchers are really good at figuring out the plan of action. Researchers are really good at deduction and analyzing information. So taking all the information that you have, assembling it, massaging it, looking at exactly what it's trying to say, and then developing recommendations from that. And it may be conclusions that you have about, you know, this is the way a certain material works with a certain catalyst, or it may be, you know, these are the services that I suggest for people who are going through these particular things in life, for example. So those are skills that are very important, and those are significant skills that don't necessarily have to be used in a tenure track position. There's also technical expertise that you might not recognize. You are probably doing some level of programming if you're analyzing data. You probably can whip out a PowerPoint presentation really easily. You can whip out a 5-page report really easily because you know how to navigate Word, for example. You'd be surprised at the number of people in the industry that don't have those skills. Database design, managing data, plus your discipline specific expertise. So don't just focus on that discipline specific expertise of, okay, I can take this pipette and put it into these cells, right? That's not the only thing you can do. The actual skills that you have go way beyond that and are much more general. Other skills that you might not think about selling that you have, because you're a researcher, inclusion is just something you do. And I'm not just talking about inclusion of race, religion, culture, right? That is significant as well. But I'm talking about inclusion of differing ideas, differing philosophies, and making sense of those, accepting them for what they are, and going forward from that. So that is a huge, huge resource in industry, in academia just as the business side, which is what I would say I'm in. But having those skills will make sure that you're successful in no matter what your career path is. Flexibility and adapting to change. When you develop a hypothesis, you design the experiment, it's beautiful, you're so excited about it, and then you get to the data and it's not coming out like you expected. What do? You adapt, right? You finish that experiment, write it up, chalk it up to, science is science and it doesn't work all the time. And you adapt, figure out what else you can do, what you can do differently, and then you conduct that next experiment, right? That's just the basis of being a researcher. So for us as researchers, we have inherent inclusion, inherent flexibility, we adapt, we persevere, we don't give up. We might go throw a tantrum or go out for a beer or whatever it is, go out for a major run after the failure, but then we pick it up and we keep on going. I mean, that's what we're trained to do as researchers. Negotiating authorship will give you this skill. Negotiating a certain type of position within the research lab or research team, negotiating salary, all of those things can help you. Negotiating differences of opinion about what a particular data point means. Negotiating to reviewers when you have a manuscript under review and you're revising it now, you persevered that far, you're revising it, and you have to negotiate why this is important and why they should accept this publication and why it's important to the field, right? So you have all of these, what I would call soft skills, budgeting, time management, regardless of how much you beat yourself up over time management, you guys still are way more skilled in that than the general population. You will never be able to talk me out of that one. All right. So those are the skills that you have, but I encourage you to really think about who you are. Who are you? What is your background? What are your expectations for yourself? What are other expectations of you by others? What do you like to do? If you don't like to be restricted into a tenure track position, consider alternatives. You could be a PhD technician supporting the research. You would still be authoring publications. You would still be contributing to all these things that are important to you. But it's important for you to know that you might not have job security, right? You might have to have really good negotiation skills and marketing skills of yourself and be able to explain how you can help people if you don't have that tenure track position. But if you do go the tenure track route, you know that you are going to be locked in to serving on committees, overseeing student research, making sure that your students are doing what they need to, writing grants, funding people. So you really have to be an administrator. It's a CEO position of a particular research team or a lab. So if that's not you, that's okay. There are other options. And moving on, if we talk about other options for you, I'm here to tell you that the compliance arena at universities is job security. And that's because every university in the United States is required to follow federal requirements. It just is. I don't see that going away, and it is just increased and increased over the last 30, 40 years. So things like the ethical treatment of humans and animals, that's not going away. We strongly believe in treating people well when they're engaged in research, letting them know what they're getting themselves into, reporting it correctly, keeping information private. All of that is a given. that's not going away. So we will always need people at research institutions, either at universities or otherwise, to make sure that that happens. There will always be that oversight and that support for researchers. Same goes with animals. Export controls, I'll talk a little bit more about what that entails, but it's really sharing data, equipment, and services with people outside the US. So there's a lot of regulations around that. Safety in the lab, not only for the people conducting the research, but also for the public health. So if things make it into the environment that shouldn't have been, that's something that safety professionals need to guard against. Other ethical issues like conflicts of interest, research misconduct evaluations, all of those are by federal requirement. Financial issues such as the use of grant funds and protection of intellectual property. So there are federal requirements about all of these things. There may be tweaks to them along the lines or down the line, but I don't see us getting rid of any of those regulations. So given that, what does a compliance professional actually do? So yes, we look at policy. We read the federal regulations. We read interpretations of the federal regulations, either by the regulatory agency or in case law. So we look at requirements at varying levels, federal requirements, state level requirements, especially for us in safety areas, sponsor requirements, so NIH, NSF, NASA, DOD, Department of Education, Department of Justice, they all have specific requirements in addition to the overall federal framework for regulations. Our University of Texas Regents have specific policies and requirements, and the university has its own that are on top of these different requirements. So a compliance professional has to be aware of all of those within their specific area of expertise. So then that compliance professional, knowing these regulations, knowing these requirements, we develop policy and procedures, forms, training to implement those requirements. And it's not just that we say, okay, you guys go and meet the requirements now. Our most important job, in my opinion, is to help people meet those requirements. So that means that we give guidance. We answer phone calls, we walk people through different questions on a protocol or on a disclosure. We provide training, we give presentations, one-on-one, large groups, in the field, at conferences, it doesn't matter. We are helping people meet those requirements. It's our job as compliance professionals to inform people of what the requirements are, not just to identify areas of non-compliance. So we also are responsible for coordinating committee reviews by subject matter experts. And in my area, most of those, the vast majority of those are faculty. So we have committees, the IRB for human subjects, IACUC for animals, et cetera, that review specific protocols or disclosures that adhere to or are in response to regulatory requirement or other requirement. And then the committee would make determinations or recommendations based on their subject matter experts. Compliance professionals identify and report issues of non-compliance. So it's not enough just to have protocols in place, reporting documents like disclosure of financial interest for conflicts of interest. We need to make sure that there is a way for us to identify when there is non-compliance. So we have to oversee all of that. And we have to report issues. Now, this is not an institutional requirement. This is usually whoever the requirement comes from, whether it's federal, state, sponsor, regents, etc., they require us to identify noncompliance and report it. It's not just that we are required to be the enforcers, right? So just to throw that in there. And then the next question, if we do file a report with NIH, for example, that we have violated whatever policy, and by we usually mean that UTSA is reporting something that happened with a graduate student, a postdoc, a PI, faculty, staff, whatever it is. And it may have been an honest error, it may have been an accident, but we're still required to report it. The next question out of their mouth is, okay, how are you going to prevent this from happening again? So that we need to then adjust, right? We have those skills as a researcher. We go back and adjust. Okay, this is a gap. We identified a gap. It's not necessarily working. So let's tighten up our oversight or improve our training information that we give out, or let's do kind of a town hall thing throughout the year to focus on improving our communication about a particular requirement. Another thing compliance professionals do is lead, coordinate, and or respond to investigations. Now, those investigations could be internal. I have also had OHARP from Human Research Oversight come to us, an external complaint. I've had NIH come in, I've had DOJ come in, Department of Education come in. So these oversight agencies do come in and ask specific questions about protocols, data, and then they look at all the things we have in place. What's your policy? What are your procedures? What is your review like? Who is doing the review? How did you record it? How did you determine that the review met the requirement for these regulations, right? So that's another thing that compliance professional does, is they have to answer on behalf of the institution that we are following whatever requirements are in place. That can be pretty scary. When you're looking at a special agent of whatever agency or somebody from the OIG's office, and that's the Office of Inspector General, and you're having to answer for these things, you want to make sure that you know exactly what that PI was doing, or that student or postdoc or whoever it is. So that's in a nutshell what a compliance professional does. Now, I wanted to spend the rest of the time really going into what it really looks like in specific areas. And I think I've already addressed this for the most part. Why are compliance professionals important? It's to facilitate high ethical standards, implement regulatory compliance. I went over that pretty extensively. But it's also to support financial stewardship of tax dollars. So if you're talking about federal regulations, they're usually put in place to prevent fraud. And that could be scientific fraud, like academic integrity issues. But it could also be financial fraud, where the public doesn't trust our research for either academic integrity or financial fraud. Using, I've heard in NSF talk about grant funds being used to buy jet skis, to buy Airbnbs for vacations, pay mortgages, etc. So that's why we have those reviews in place. And I know it's a pain, and I agree it's a pain, but we have to have them. So if we think about what human ethics professionals do, they work with the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board. They review research protocols against federal regulations. So there has to be enough information on a document to show that there was enough information for a determination as stated in 45 CFR 46, and that's the human subjects federal regulations. So that's why the protocol is written as it is, for those of you who have filled out an IRB protocol. The human ethics professional, our staff, also support the IRB's review. So some of the protocols don't have to go to the IRB. Those are reviewed by the human ethics professional to determine whether or not they need IRB review. Not everything needs the review by the committee. So that's what the human ethics professional does. They implement local policy consistent with the regulations. They develop procedures to help researchers meet those regulations, and they do training. They develop training, they help people through the process. They answer specific questions. They help faculty sponsors mentor students in some cases. But human ethics professionals are indirectly overseen by the Office for Human Research Protections. So when you're a compliance professional, you don't just have your boss telling you what to do. You have federal agencies making sure that their boss is telling them what to do, right? So the university responds to anything OHARP asks, requests. Well, I wouldn't say anything. Sometimes we have to negotiate. But human ethics professionals help these areas because there is a regulatory requirement for that. Now, if we talk about lab animal professionals, it's the same thing, except there's an IACUP, which is a committee of subject matter experts. And then they develop procedures to help research meet the regulations, just like human ethics professionals do. But the oversight agency for lab animal professionals is the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. There's also the USDA that can come in. There's also other sponsors that can come in. NIH can come in. And then if there were any related areas, such as recombinant DNA used, then a portion of the NIH can come in and look at biosafety issues, for example. So if we move on to a different type of research compliance, export control professionals are fairly new in academic settings, and fairly new, I would say, within the last 10 years or so, but it's really increased in the last 6 or so years. And the federal attention to this field or area of expertise is only increasing. If you've heard anything about foreign influence, this is absolutely one area where they are, the oversight agencies, which I'm showing you here, have become extremely strict and very rigid. So export control professionals, what do they do? It's a highly technical area where it can be, but they develop what's called control plans, technology control plans, information control plans, and they implement local policy that is consistent with regulations and local expectations. Another thing that they do is they'll evaluate physical spaces for security concerns, and that's physical security. So our regulators require us to make sure that nobody has access to specific information. If it's on their list, the regulatory agency's list of controlled items, then it has to be physically secure. That means it has to be in a locked cabinet, a locked office, or a locked rack. If it's a computer server, for example. So the export control professional actually will work on those things and then ensure that and have oversight of that over time. Review research grants against federal and contractual regulations. So if there is a contract that we are signing with the DoD, for example, the Department of Defense, and it's for fundamental research, that DoD contract can absolutely have export control requirements in there. Why? Because DoD wants to. No other reason than that. Our faculty can tell us all day long that it is fundamental research. That means it's not export controlled. They're going to publish on it, right? But if that term is in the contract, then that agency is requiring us to secure it as if it were export controlled. So there are specific requirements because the contract says so. We do try to negotiate those out. Sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not. And so if you ever are in that situation on the other side, on the researcher side, now you know why that is. Develop procedures to help researchers and university administrators at various levels meet expectations. And that just means that the export control professional is using their knowledge of the regulations, of the requirements, of the case law, for example, to help guide the university's decisions and to help guide the documents that we hold, how long we hold them, etc. And then, you know, we are all required to relay this information to the university community, and that can be researchers, it can be university administrators, and it can be our regulatory agencies. So training is very important. So moving on to safety professionals. Those of you who are in the hard sciences may recognize some of these. So if you use lasers, radiation, biosafety, chemical safety, and physical safety from OSHA, all of those things are important to safety professionals. Now, you can be a biosafety professional or a chemical hygiene officer. You can have a level of specificity, or you can be a very general safety officer. Some smaller institutions, for example, have a safety officer that has to cover everything. And then if you are at the management level, then you would have to be responsible for knowing at least some of these, although you may have staff who have specific expertise. So what do safety professionals do? They develop safety plans. So we at the institution have biosafety plans, we have select agent safety plans, we have, we're working on our engineering safety plan, and we implement, so the safety professional implements that with local policies that are consistent with regulations, other expectations. So for example, when Dr. Amy came in as president, he had as a former VPR, high level of experience with accidents. Two institutions that he was with had major accidents where he was responsible for responding and, you know, the consequences thereof. And so we have different expectations here at UTSA than UT Tyler might, or that UT RGV might. So the safety professional has to have knowledge of all of those and implement the policy within that framework. I have to evaluate physical spaces for safety concerns. That means doing lab evaluations. I have to respond to spills, accidents, investigations, and they have to have good relationships with lab staff or research team staff. So making sure that people know who to go to report a spill. For example, if somebody spilled acid on their hand or on their shoe, for example, when they go to the doctor, they should have specific information to be able to give to their nurse, the doctor, intake, whatever it is, so that they would have more immediate treatment than the general population. So lab safety staff can help with all of those things. Another area that safety professionals do is review research protocols against federal and state regulations. So we have biosafety committee, we have a chemical safety committee, we have a radiation laser safety committee. So those committees review research protocols to make sure that the research is being done in a safe way. And then developing procedures to help researchers meet those expectations. We don't want to put procedures in place that are such a barrier that researchers aren't going to follow them. We need to make it as easy as possible for the researcher to facilitate compliance. And then we need to make sure that we have oversight and support during the action of research or the conduct of research in those areas, so that people are following it not only at the protocol stage or when they're trying to get something approved, but during the conduct of the research, so that everybody stays safe. Now, we don't have, for the most part, we don't have regulations and requirements in place just to have them, right? There's a reason why we have containment requirements for select agents, right? We don't want that getting into the air. We don't want people exposed to that. And we have to make sure that that containment stays solid, and the integrity of that is monitored over time. So those are some things that safety professionals do, and they're always training, they're always helping support the research that's being done. And just generally, research ethics professionals do similar things. They're implementing local policy, they're developing procedures to meet those. They're also reviewing specific disclosures, whether it's financial interests, other commitments, maybe looking at research misconduct allegations. We are supporting committee reviews. So there may be an ad hoc review committee that's pulled together to review some issue. And then administrative reviews. I get pulled into audits on campus, internal audits and external audits. I get pulled into compliance reviews of other areas, not research compliance reviews, to help people understand the research environment and what it's about and what's accepted practice and what's not, because it's different from a regular 8 to 5 office job. Expectations can be a little bit different and across disciplines. And then research ethics professionals will conduct investigations and then provide recommendations, maybe looking at best practices at other institutions, or looking at consequences that would be appropriate for a particular non-compliance finding. And then also training. We always would rather be proactive and help support people not engage in misconduct or prevent non-compliance. Didn't want that double negative. And so training is much more important than the enforcement side or the investigation side, because it just takes up way too much time. Research administration professionals, I went into a lot of that. These are some specific things. One thing that we'll do in financial areas is verify whether a cost that is being presented to be charged to a grant or external funds is allowable according to the budget or according to that sponsor requirement. Can you allocate it to that project? And I can't tell you how difficult this is sometimes, because auditors will come in and they will say, well, how can you allocate those particular paper towels to this project? Weren't you using those paper towels for another project as well? And then PIs look at us like we have 3 heads when we say that to them, right? So just know that it's not us coming up with crazy issues and enforcement questions, but it's usually the auditors that we are hearing from. And then, is it reasonable within the context of the budget that was approved and the sponsor's requirements, looking at those financial reasonability issues? Like if you have on your budget that you were going to buy 5 computers for human subjects to take go through experiments on, and you buy those 5 computers at the very end of your project, that's not reasonable, right? So those are things that the research administration professionals question. Identifying non-compliance and supporting those corrections are very important. And then modifying those procedures to make sure that we prevent those things from happening in the future. And then leading, coordinating, and or responding to audits. That is always something that is in our wheelhouse. And then training others. So where do you go if you want more information about any of these areas or other areas that I haven't covered? And there are a bunch in research compliance. There are oversight agencies that you can go to: OHARP, OLAW, Department of Justice, Office of Research Integrity at the federal level under DHHS, Department of State, Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury. You can go to those oversight agencies and see what their requirements are. What kinds of things do they expect of professionals in this area? You can go poke around websites or go to conferences in specific professional organizations or reach out to members of these organizations. Some are PRIMER, ABSA, HCCA, that's the Healthcare Compliance Association, and SCCE is the Society for Corporate Compliance and Ethics. And then you could also reach out to other research compliance professionals and you can shadow them. You can interview them. You know, a lot of people do want to mentor others in these areas. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. But I do want to just thank you for your attendance today. And then I haven't been monitoring the chat. And if you put anything in there, I don't see anything here.
I don't see anything on chat, Mickey. We'll just open it up for questions from the floor. So any questions for Dr. Stevenson?
Yeah, I have a question.
Can you introduce yourself and just let us know where you're from? So.
Sure, I'm Greg Jellick. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Chemistry. And my question for Dr. Stevenson is, locally, if you have a local compliance issue at one of our departments, who is your muscle? If somebody doesn't want to do something, who would someone have to answer to? And I guess my other question would be, do you have any examples without naming names?
Okay, so your first question is, if somebody doesn't want to do something or if they don't want to be compliant, then how do we get them to be compliant, right? So the first thing I do is try to have good relationships with faculty in a variety of departments. So if we have a good relationship, then it would be easier to go to them and say, hey, this is a requirement. I know you don't want to do this, or I know you haven't had time to now. What can I do to help you, right? So I try that approach first. If that doesn't work, and it's not an immediate like threat of life, then I would work through the department chair. If the department chair isn't acting, I can, if they have external funding, I can suspend their funding. I do not do that very often because usually either the department chair or the associate dean for research in the college would be able to go to them more as a peer and say, this just has to be done. Now, if we do suspend their funding, there is the possibility that we have to notify the funding agency. So let's say it's NSF funding, then we may have to go to them and say, look, this guy wasn't, or this lady wasn't compliant, and we had to suspend their funding. That also can have a ripple effect on graduate students, postdocs, technicians, et cetera. So that we really try to have that as a last resort. But the vice president for research is my boss, vice president for research, economic development, and knowledge enterprise, does have a lot of authority over these regulatory areas. And so they can suspend a protocol, for example. So if it's an animal protocol, human protocol, we can suspend those as well. Probably not going to happen in chemistry, but in other departments it would. And so, you know, that's my philosophy, is try the man-to-man approach. And I don't mean to be sexist here, but person-to-person approach here. You know, have that conversation with them. What can we do to help you be compliant? And then go up the chain. Sometimes it does go up to the provost. There's rare occasions though. And then your next question, I'm sorry, Greg, what was your next question?
Oh, it just had to do with if there was an example, but I guess, you know, the main reason for asking that question is, as a former QA manager, I can see where, you know, and if you look at, you know, federal regulatory, state regulatory agencies, when they say you're out of compliance, if you don't have any enforcement arm, then it's just kind of frustrating and a lot of hot air. So I was kind of curious if you had, you know, the muscle that you needed in your position to get people to do what you wanted, and it sounds like you do. Money is a big motivator.
Yeah. And I can give you an example. So several years ago, a student in chemistry was washing a beaker, didn't realize it had water reactive chemical in it. It exploded. She was injured. The lab was shut down. The PI was placed on administrative leave for a period of time. The students had to be overseen by other faculty. And there was a flood, there was a fire. So it was just a horrible situation. So how have we remedied that? Well, we have a much better relationship with the chemistry faculty than we did then, and we being kind of lab safety. And it was under a different VP at that time. And so now that it's under research, we understand better what researchers are going through. We're researchers helping researchers. So it's not like we're under the police department where we're coming in and shutting everything down and not listening to what's going on. But we understand what it's like to be in a research situation and have, you know, a spill or, you know, something that we didn't intend to happen. It wasn't like it was intentional or anything. So, so that's one example that I can give.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Greg. Anybody else have any questions?
Hi, oops, sorry. Hi, Dr. Stevenson. I was just wondering if there is a fundamental difference between the job of a research compliance person at a medical school versus an undergraduate institution. And really the question there is, how much do you connect with the academic mission, or how much do you oversee? So you mentioned, for example, that students become an issue in these sorts of compliance things and how they are handled and who looks after their training in the event of these things that are much more of an institutional research risk. And it seems like there's a division there. So I'm wondering where you connect to the academic mission and if it's very different at medical and undergraduate institutions.
So the difference between academic and medical institutions is, one, the structure of research. So the med school usually has a VPR-like person, as well as the rest of the institution. So it's like having two VPRs at an institution. They don't always see eye to eye. They can have different procedures. They can have different expectations, different culture about how things are done, what consequences are put in place. So because of that clinical and medical arm, That's one distinguishing feature. The other thing is we don't do clinical billing, and that's a huge audit risk. It's a huge oversight risk. And so that allows us to focus on other things rather than spending a lot of overhead and resources on monitoring clinical billing. In terms of where we fit with the academic mission or how some of these issues are resolved or overseen, we have to partner closely with the provost office. And so we work any kind of situation, whether it's just an inquiry or something that was alleged or a suspicion of noncompliance. We're usually talking to department chair, associate dean for research. We involve the dean, let them know if it's something that might need their attention. Give them a heads up first. They can relay that to the provost if they need to. I also work with AVPs in the provost office. And if there is a need to work with students, I rely on the academic side to do that, but we coordinate very strongly.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So I'll just add to that as the dean of the graduate school. So the graduate school is involved if they're graduate students and postdocs. If it's undergraduate, it's a different arm within the provost office. So there is there's a lot of collaboration, cooperation in there. And we work, as Dr. Stevenson mentioned, with the research arm, with your individual dean, as well as the associate deans for research and the associate dean for the graduate programs within your college.
Any other questions?
Well, we're almost at time. So thank you, Dr. Stevenson. This is really useful. And I'm hoping students and faculty and administrators got a lot of this. We appreciate your time. Thank you. And thank you for everybody who's attending.
Thank you.
Have a good day,
Thank
everyone.
you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.